Alright, well, today's programme is going to be on the topics of paradox and dogma in the scientific model. Just for a change, I think we've had enough dealing with paedophilia and court cases and all of the other hideous abuses in the world, and it's time to dismantle the scientific model, I think, a little. Right, first of all, I suppose I need to qualify really that my basis for my thinking on the paradox and dogma in the scientific model, in the general model of reality, is not based on watching a few YouTube vids and possibly reading the odd book, but is largely based on a lifetime having been spent studying the various reductionist scientific models from very early childhood, and also possibly, I suppose, studying certain religious, social constructs, political constructs, and realising that within most of these models that we are given for the rationalising of what we all sort of agree on, the reality, this is real hard doing. You people have no idea how difficult this is to formulate your thoughts and to speak at the same time. Had I written all this down, perhaps it would be a little easier. And I find this so much easier to do face to face. If I had somebody in the room to speak this, then this would be much easier for me to formulate my thoughts. Right, you'll have to excuse me. Right, bear with me. Right, we have a model of reality that we all share components of, that we have an agreed reality that certain aspects of we can all concur on. There are other elements of individual realities that seem to be extraordinary, that seem to be paradoxical. I suppose first of all we ought to examine the word paradox. Essentially a paradox is, I suppose I really ought to call up a dictionary meaning here, but a paradox is essentially two statements that are mutually exclusive and mutually contradictory. So for a scientific model to contain paradox, that would mean that two observations of reality, both held up to be correct by scientific examination. Yeah, right. You're right, Kaz. You're finding out, aren't you? Completely lost my bloody thread again. Bugger. Sorry folks, my main mixing desk went wrong on me before my show on Thursday, and we've been dealing with a lot of stuff at home here, so I've had to reinstate my old awful mixing desk from the spare room and cobble it together in the last sort of 15 minutes before I went on air, so excuse me if I don't seem particularly composed. Right, paradox. Yes, so essentially we have two observed phenomena which are agreed as being provable, repeatable, confirmable. So essentially I can give you the means, the description of the observation that I made, and you can go off and make an observation that concurs with my results. Now, if we have two sets of observations that are at odds through the current scientific model, then what we then get is what's described as a paradox, which is where two observations of reality do not match the known model. Now, what tends to happen, because many of the scientific techniques developed through the 20th century were so very, very effective at describing certain elements of reality. The quantum revolution was certainly, I mean, all of the electronics that we are using currently are reliant on the quantum model in order to be able to be, for their parameters to be able to be calculated and for them to be made at all. And certainly on the level of electronics, and of the microcosm, the very small, quantum mechanics appears to hold to be an entirely true model, as is borne out by the fact that we can manufacture things like microprocessors. Without the quantum model holding to be true, then your microprocessor simply wouldn't work, or would never have been able to be built in the first place. So we're left with this paradox between the Newtonian model, in which we have the fixed ordered universe, the kind of Bulbarian universe I like to think of it as, where everything is thought of in terms of little balls that are in orbit around other little balls, be that planets, be that galaxies, or be that electrons around the nucleus of an atom. And again, the Newtonian model is a very effective model. If I shove you really hard, then according to Newtonian mechanics, you fall on your arse. Well, funnily enough, if I shove you hard enough, you'll fall on your arse. So certainly the Newtonian model appears to hold true there. But then when we start to look into the subatomic world, attempting to apply the Newtonian model to the subatomic world, would appear that the subatomic world was completely chaotic and non-Newtonian, or largely non-Newtonian. Bloody distractions. She says she's sorry. It's alright, everyone. Elena says she's sorry. Talk about put me off my stroke again. Right, okay, so we have the Newtonian model, which appears to model reality very effectively on the macro scale. And then when we get down to the subatomic level, Newtonian mechanics begins to fall apart. So we have this outright paradox between Newtonian mechanics and quantum mechanics, and yet we have both held to be true. So essentially that leaves us with a paradoxical model which unfortunately, due to the nature of the costing of scientific research, the university fundings and the like, we've got more and more dogma creeping in to the scientific model. So essentially we have elements of the scientific model like black holes, the Big Bang, the description of protons and electrons, which are all pretty much about as fixed as any scientific idea can be in any real terms. Essentially these terms are no longer open for debate. They have become dogmatic. They have become the accepted model. Now, to my mind, science is the perpetual inquiry for refinement of any given model. So the second that you have a basis for science, which includes large sections of paradox and fields of inquiry that have become entirely dogmatic and fixed and rigid, then what we're talking about is no longer a science, but it's effectively a religion. And that this is my feeling, that the scientists that we look to find the solutions for us in the laboratories and the research institutes around the world are essentially running what is now a religion. I wouldn't like to suggest as exactly what the god of their particular religion would be, but if you apply the doctrine, if you apply the measure of a religion, then then you will see that mainstream science is essentially as a unformulated religion, I suppose it would be, but nonetheless dogmatic and paradoxical. So essentially it is down to all of those of us who are not confined by the university education, by the funding limitations and restrictions that are put onto our researches, to apply Occam's razor, logic, deduction, gnosis, perhaps to an extent, to the current models, and to try and reformulate those models into models that are intellectually less difficult to grasp, less complex, less up their own arse, let's be honest. I mean, if you read most scientific books, the descriptions and the proofs are wrapped in such confined knowledge that unless you happen to be of a particular group that has studied a particular branch of maths or a particular style of science, then you are not going to even have the language in order to be able to describe or discuss or to think about these things. So first of all, a bit like the Plain English campaign, I want to begin to instill in people an idea of plain science. It's very much like the law in regards as the only people that want it to remain complex are those who it serves for the majority not to understand. Science doesn't need to be wrapped in unintelligible jargon. There are certain terms and certain constructs that you have to become acquainted with in order to be able to really consider many of these topics fully. But most of it is language that we may not use commonly, but we've got a fair grasp of what it means. And that's going to be my second topic for today, is the codifying of language, the reclaiming of jargon, the reclaiming of technical language. Okay, so let's sort of move into a particular field of science and kind of dissect that for its paradox. And the field of science that's probably really the least understood, if the most studied, is that of biology. The various agents of biology, the various chemical reagents, the actions of enzymes, the function of the various parts of cells may be largely modelled, but when it comes down to it, the actual origins of biology are still largely a complete grey area to mainstream science. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been scientists that have been working on reconstructing the model of biology over the years. One of the, in my mind, the greatest exponents of this was Wilhelm Reich. And although most people know him for his work in the field of orgonomy, orgone science, which is essentially a scientific jargon term to describe chi energy, bioenergetic fields. Now, Reich was a pure gold standard scientist. He would follow an avenue of inquiry until he was satisfied with the results that he was getting, had described that particular field of inquiry to a reasonable degree, and usually in each field of research he would be led up his next avenue of research as a direct result of the work that he'd done previously. What most people don't realise was that Wilhelm Reich was in fact a student of the Austrian School of Psychiatry, that had Freud as its chief professor at the time, and Freud apparently recognised Reich's bright mind and keen ability in the field, and very shortly had him as a research assistant, and finally as head of department before the two went their separate ways. And certainly in the field of psychiatry, although it's largely not taught in the schools at the time, in the 1930s, it was considered that Reich had essentially rewritten the Freudian model of psychiatry, the Freudian model being basically based upon unrealised sexual desires, largely concerning those between yourself, your parents and your siblings. And frankly, I don't know about you, but I've never had any particular repressed desire to shag my mother, kill my father, or rape my sisters. Essentially, Reich was described as Freud in his early work as being the father of psychotherapy. Freud was reckoned to be the father of psychiatry, and Freud kind of passed that torch on to Reich. If you've been for any sort of cognitive behavioural therapy or talking counselling, talking therapy, then you have been under a Reichian treatment regime. He used his work with the rich and famous in Austria and Berlin, unlike Freud, who managed to feather his nest quite nicely and develop a small estate that still lives on to this day, with his with Clement Freud and Emma Freud being his descendants that inherit that estate currently, I believe. Reich turned his money instead into developing a set of 200 free at source psychiatric psychotherapy and sexual health clinics around Berlin, and through the doors of those 200 clinics he had over 100,000 free to source clients using those services and receiving sexual health advice, pregnancy prevention, and general counselling. Certainly Reich found the world to be in a very neurotic state in the 30s. We're talking about post-First World War Europe, and the middle of the tribulations between the handover from the royal states of the Victorian age to the nation states, the diplomatic states of the 20th century. Anyway, so Reich essentially was a psychiatrist, so one might wonder what he was doing looking into the fields of biology. Well, Reich was a reductionist of the highest order. Fuck off. Look, if anybody out there has got a chair that doesn't bloody creak in the London area that can get it to me before 6 o'clock, then I can stop creaking. Other than that, piss off you lot, there's nothing to do about it. I'm a fidget ass. This chair has dozens of teenagers climbing all over it perpetually, you know what I mean? Michael insists on sitting on it backwards and rocking backwards and forwards. The poor thing is literally kind of, as you can hear, there we go. And no, it's not my bloody hips. Right, okay, so Reich essentially was pursuing the field of psychiatry, and was firstly his research. In his researches, he realised that Freud only ever studied the neurotic. He only ever studied people that were unwell, and Reich realised that this was not a scientific. This was not a very scientific approach to dealing with the problem, because unless you had a comparison set, then essentially you were dealing with guesswork. That whatever you were doing to try and heal the sick by way of their neuroses, you were doing largely by by guesswork and by the application of a reduction method by which you made mistakes and then corrected those mistakes in the future. Well, obviously, when you're dealing with treating people's mental health issues, making mistakes wasn't necessarily an option. Certainly it wasn't for Reich. So he began to firstly psychoanalyze the well-adjusted, the healthy, the successful. And this, first of all, gave him a subset, a comparison subset, with which he could then measure his results scientifically with his work with the neurotic and the ill and the mentally ill. From examining this subset, he realised that the Victorian characterology, it can't really be described as a science, but the system of characterology of defining somebody's innate nature from their exterior experience actually held true to a large extent, and that largely he was finding that his patients that were suffering neurosis would largely be very thin, very hunched, very thin-faced, or, to the other extreme, they would be excessively obese, or morbidly obese, we would describe it as now, I believe. They would, and if they fit into neither of those categories, then their faces would have extreme features. And he realised that what this was, and that when he compared this to the control group, to the non-neurotic group, that he saw that the larger part of his non-neurotic group were of an average size. Their features were rarely extreme. Their physique was rarely extreme. Their body posture was less extreme. So again, they would hold themselves better. They would walk straighter. They would sit straighter. They would hold their heads better. Their features of their face would be more relaxed, and this he is what he put down the extreme facial characteristics of the neurotic type to, was that the extreme muscle tension that accompanied the neurosis would set the face into an unnatural frame. Piss off about my bloody chair. I can't help it. I'm a fidget ass. So essentially he began to realise that because muscle tension was an electrical property within the body, that perhaps he could measure the galvanic skin response, what they use for the lie detector tests. By measuring the galvanic skin response, he wondered if perhaps he could measure this overactivity in the stimulation of these various body muscles, and have essentially a voltmeter on the mind, so he could then apply his therapeutic techniques through the graphic representation of the galvanometer readings, and determine the immediate efficacy of his treatments. And what he discovered with the application of the galvanometer was that indeed various emotional states were accompanied by very, very distinctly different charges, voltage charges, measurable on the surface of the skin. His particular field of inquiry was largely based around sexual health and sexual politics, and he began to look into the mechanics of arousal, and found that largely the mechanics of sexual arousal and the mechanics of orgasm were both based in this galvanic response, in this bioelectrical response at the skin surface. So initially he found the human responses to be very varied and quite difficult to extrapolate. So he looked for the Occam's razor, the simplest effective model which he could apply to gain clearer statistical evidence. And he realised that essentially we are all biological machines, and that the bioelectrical results that he was able to read from a human organism would probably be there in more simple organisms. And so he turned to microbes, and more precisely he turned specifically to the amoeba. And on closely studying the amoeba, and by applying various stimuli and stimuli, various rewards and punishment stimuli to these amoeba, he realised that the amoebas were in fact utilising this bioelectrical field on the surface of the cell, on the surface of the organism. An amoeba is a single-celled organism, and that it was the variance of this bioelectrical field that in fact produced what we see as movement in the amoeba. That the amoeba would sense its environment by putting out a tentacle, by extending a tentacle, and by reading the bioenergetic field of the area surrounding the tentacle, would decide whether that area was profitable or dangerous or hazardous. And if it found it hazardous, then it would retract the tentacle and extend another one somewhere else. Or if it found it to be bioenergetically compatible, then the amoeba would essentially pour itself into the tentacle, and the amoeba would move sort of one step to the right. This fascinated Reich. He thought that he had begun to see the mechanism that underlies biology being driven by these electrical currents. But when he actually looked into it's a creaking chairs make one neurotic. You'd have to ask Reich. I'll tell you what, look, if I pick my feet up I won't creak so much. There you go. There you go. Look, oh no, it still bloody creaks. Oh fuck it. You'll have to put up with it. Get me a new chair. Oh, leave me alone. I'm skint. Right. Yeah, so Reich was looking into amoebas, and thought that the mechanism was electricity. I mean, bearing in mind that in the 1920s, 1930s, electricity was all the rage, you know what I mean? Everything was electricity, the future was electricity. But it was actually largely still quite poorly understood. So Reich began to apply various electrical stimuli to the amoeba, and realised that he could induce certain okay, bifurcation, I don't know, we'll see about that. Yeah, so we've got he tried to apply strong electrical stimuli to the amoeba, and found that he couldn't replicate the subtlety of the responses with a simple electrical stimuli. He could initiate particular responses, but they lacked the subtlety of the natural responses, and he understood that what he was dealing with was a much less clear-cut description than what he at first thought he'd stumbled upon. So Reich, in his kind of lateral thinking, began to consider the actual nature of biology itself, and the actual timeline of this I'm not entirely clear on, but I know that Reich had, as a young student, observed the moving blobs that we all see in a clear blue sky. If we look into a clear blue sky, one can see kind of translucent blobs moving in any patch of clear sky, and that these were and are described by the current scientific model as the hemoglobin moving through the veins in the back of the eye, pressing on the optic nerve and producing an erroneous visual impression. Well, Reich, knowing this, decided to investigate, and no, she's not. She's Jake's on his way back to uni today, Kaz. So she's spending her last afternoon with Jake, and very, very good on her too. It'd be a shame to see Jake going back. It's been really good having him here. Right. Yeah. So he considered. So he'd seen these blobs in the sky, and he considered what he could do to prove or disprove this statement that they're erroneous visual stimuli at the back of the retina. And so Reich did what Reich only could do, and he looked through a telescope at them and found that he could magnify them. Well, in Reich's mind, that anything that is magnifiable by an external optical device has to be external to the eye. Thanks, Kev. Has to be external to the eye, in which case the things that had been put down to blood moving through the back of the eye couldn't possibly be down to that explanation. The telescope wouldn't have magnified them. So this set him into a field of inquiry that led him into considering that the biological urge is in fact one from inorganic to organic, that everything around us that we see as biology is in fact made up of clumps of the inorganic. The carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen that makes up the stuff of our cells is essentially inorganic until it's combined in the stuff that makes a cell, and then it becomes what we know as biology. So he decided to look into the model of how biology comes about, and found it to be largely lacking in with so many paradoxes and so many unknowns that he found himself dealing with. Can you just shout up and down the stairs a bit more, please, Michael? In fact, better still, just stand at the bottom of the stairs and shout whatever it was that you had to say to your mum.
Sorry.
Thank you. So essentially Reich decided that he wanted to examine this model of biology, and so he started to look into what wasn't biology. So he considered something that was the least biological that he could think of, and for him, he thought of incandescent straw. Now, basically, to incandesce a piece of straw, it has to be heated to over 2,200 degrees centigrade. Incandesced is when it gives off white light. So essentially, we are talking about the ultimate sterilisation that could take place. Essentially, there would be nothing left of the straw except for a few carbon atoms and a few minerals that have been taken up by the grass during its me, the big bully. If you saw the size of him, only bloody 14, he towers above me already, big lump. So Reich took this incandescent straw and placed it into a nutrient medium, a sterile nutrient medium. The same as when you're at school, you get the Petri dishes and you get the sterile agar jelly and smear some kind of, a bit of the inside of your gum or something on there and watch all the fungus grow. and he placed this incandescent straw into this vial of nutrient jelly, along with several control flasks containing different substances, and within 2 or 3 days he found that the jelly would begin to cloud. And when he examined the contents of this cloudy nutrient gel, there were basically globules forming within it that although nothing that you could describe as biology had emerged, there were simple cell-like structures. There were lipids appearing to form and close into basically a cell wall containing a fluid solution in the inside. And he took a sample of this inoculated nutrient, and then placed it into some fresh nutrient and placed it into an incubation cupboard and kept it at sort of room temperature for a number of days. Piss off with the creaking! Tell him. Here he is. He's the one that's broke my chair. Michael?
Yes?
They're all complaining about the creaking. What was I saying about sitting backwards on my fucking chair? Who is it that sits backwards on my chair?
You.
Who is it that rocks backwards and forwards continually and can never, ever sit still?
You.
I just stand there and crinkle a bloody bag on microphone.
Where's the Leatherman? Or I need a lot of wire cutter because I need to cut a bit of thing because we're cutting my leg up and stuff.
Can't you just twist it up and knock it out? Oh, for God's sake! Look, it's nearly 4 o'clock. Let me put on a tune and sort this bloody get out.
Stop. Sorry. There are people who are live and stuff.
No, don't even go there. You're just too bad to
They're not that important to me, but they're important to him.
I don't know what I'm going to play.
Shh, Kaz. Shh.
Yeah,
definitely
just. I don't know what to bloody play.
Just play anything.
Oh, but that's. Oh, as it goes, corporate cosmology. Here we go. Bit of Jack Outerworld and the quantum singularity.
Primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it. Is that clear? You think you've merely stopped a business deal? That is not the case. The Arabs have taken millions of dollars out of this country, and now they must put it back. It is ebb and flow, tidal gravity. It is ecological balance. You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are nations. There are no nations. There are no earths. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immense, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, rank marks, fringe, rubles, pounds, and marks. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things to be. That is the atomic and subatomic and galactic structure of things today. And you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide and Exxon. Those are the nations today. What do you think the Russians talk about in the Council of State? Dogma? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of slime. Our children will live, Mr. Beale, to see that perfect world in which there's no war or famine or oppression or brutality. One vast and ecumenical hope for whom all men to serve a common in which all men will hold a share of stock. All necessities provided, anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. I have chosen you, Mr. Beale, to preach this adventure.
Why me?
It's your own television, dummy. 60 million people watch you every night of the week, Monday through Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr.
People being more harsh or uncaring for each other.
Well, that's my eldest. Packed up in a van and back off to Warwick Uni, Mr. Biochemistry himself. Right, okay. You can see why I know a lot about the reductionist, dogmatic, paradoxical model, because I spent my entire time arguing the toss with him about it. Right, what did we have there? We had Jack Outerworld and the quantum singularity with corporate cosmology, followed by Leon Pythian, Keep On Believing That We Are Free, Semi Here, and Animal, and lastly their Massive Attack, Wob Wob Wob, Paradise Circus, Zed's Dead remix. Okay, right. How could we possibly not miss you, Ray? We just didn't comment on your return, that's all. Sorry, Stingray Moore in the chat box. Mr. Personality himself. Right, okay, so essentially I was talking about Reich's investigations into amoebas, into microbiology, and then his kind of Occam's razor being applied to biology. He then ended up with this incandescent straw, providing the whatever to enable this nutrient broth to essentially mimic most of that which we measure life by. Where I'd got to is he took an initial sample from this inoculated broth and re-incubated it, and by the second or third incubation, your coffee's there. Take it off all right then. Good. By second or third incubations, instead of just seeing these sort of basic cell-like forms in the fluid, he started to see what he described as motile forms, essentially things that replicated biology. They were self-motile. They moved about in the liquid. which obviously, for a scientist looking into biology, having not induced anything biological other than the incandescent straw into this particular model, and with all of his various control flasks remaining completely unaffected, he was led to conclude that biology was in fact the decay of the inorganic to the organic, which is completely the opposite way round to the current scientific model. And once he'd kind of addressed this in his mind, he began to formulate his ideas of orgonomy, which is based around a biological field that essentially underlies biology. That biology is the shadow cast by the bioenergetic field, and essentially that what he found was that this isn't an electrical field. That although there are electrical fields that can clearly be measured on and around any biological system, that the ebbs and flows of some unseen force appeared to be driving biology and appeared to be unmeasurable by current technology. So he then pursued the orgone accumulator avenue of inquiry, and the orgone accumulator avenue of inquiry, and began to essentially collect and harvest this energy. Sorry, I've got people still marching in and out of the house and completely throwing me off my track. Right, okay, so we have one scientist who, through pure gold standard scientific inquiry, has stumbled across a complete paradox in the field of biology. The concept that biology is the inorganic decaying to organic, rather than vice versa. I mean, we can all point at the organic essentially dying and returning to its inorganic component parts. But what he was seeing was the decay of the component parts of the inorganic appearing to self-assemble into the semblances of life. Now, there have been other scientists that have pursued kind of equivalent avenues of inquiry. Sheldrake and the amorphogenic field theory is certainly one that comes to mind here. And if I can explain it. Alright. Oh, blimey, closed the door. That makes a change. Oh, that hinge. Yeah, no, I keep thinking of that as well. It's terrible, isn't it? Oh, with the sound of the bloody door knocker and the... Oh, just got out. I need my studio at the end of the garden. I need to stop being so bloody lazy and go and get it done. Oh, God. Right. So, yeah, Rupert Sheldrake and the amorphogenic field. Oh, for God's sakes. Shall I go to another tune for a minute? Oh, who's that? Oh, that's somebody else. Oh, for God's sakes, it really is fucking Piccadilly Circus here. Jake's just gone, Elena's fucking just gone out for fags, and now you walk in. Bloody hell. Right, that's Charlie back. Fuck's sake. Right, I guess it's... Right, okay, Sheldrake and the amorphogenic field. Sheldrake was looking into the flocking of birds and the shoaling of fish, and when he looked into the modelling that had been done on the schooling of fish and the the shoaling of fish and the flocking of birds, he found that the movements had been plotted mathematically, and the kind of fractal nature of the patterns had been understood, but that nobody had really looked into the incredible speed and the incredible synchronicity that the flock moves with. When he looked into it, he found that the current sort of scientific thinking on it was simply that each individual bird had a certain other number of birds within its line of sight, and that they all responded in a behaviouristic way to each other's movements, and that was how the flock maintained such tight coordinated patterns and cohesive movements. Well, when Sheldrake looked into this, he found that the signal path and response time for the nervous system to be able to for the nervous system of, say, the birds to be able to see the movement of their neighbouring bird, compute the direction and vectoring of that movement, and then to apply the control signals to the nervous system to respond to that, the flock would just fall into complete disorder. It was physically impossible for a neurological path to be describing the action of flocking birds or of shoaling fish. So immediately struck by this paradox, he realised that in fact, as well as Reith's inquiries into the individual bioenergetic field, that in fact there appeared to be some sort of an amorphogenetic field or an amorphogenic field that describes groups of animals as well as the individual itself, and that by immersing themselves into the bioenergetic field of its nearest neighbours, that the flock of birds essentially becomes as a single organism, that the bioenergetic drives, the bioenergetic attraction and repulsion affects the entire flock equally, and so all of the birds just simply feel to move the way that they move, and each of their neighbours will feel exactly the same, and so the patterns that we see of flocking and of schooling fish are displayed, and what we're actually seeing there is a direct interpretation of the bioenergetic field that actually exists there when we see a flock of starlings making all of those incredible weaving patterns in the sky, that the chances are that they are quite literally following the flux lines of this bioenergetic field as it revolves around the surface. So we have two scientists that have come upon an energetic force in the universe that we have no meters to be able to measure, no characterizing sort of evidential statistical something that they can point to and say, well, this is it. But the paradox itself, the observed effect and the paradox that existed between that and the current model was enough to there's software that can predict human crowd movement, but it doesn't it predicts it out of chaos theory, and that what it predicts is it predicts the mathematical probability of that crowd movement, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't take into consideration the length of time that the feedback responses from each person in that crowd, reading everybody else in that crowd, could possibly, everybody would be bumping into each other all the time. So we are essentially walking around immersed in this amorphogenic field that we share. So walking across a station platform, we are literally immersed into the amorphogenetic field of all of the humans on that platform and all of their various intentions and directions, and we read directly from that field. And I don't know if you've noticed, but when you're walking through a crowd, you'll get the feeling to go to the left or the right. It's very unusual that you have the sort of dotsy-do your partner incident where you meet somebody head on and neither of you can decide which way to go next. And I would suggest that on those occasions, the reason why that happens is because you stop reading the bioenergetic field and you start beginning to try and think about which way you're going to go. And as soon as you begin to think, you go wrong. Yeah? So this is... Right. Where were we? Right, so essentially we have a flawed model of biology. So do we continually refine the description of what is a fundamentally flawed model, or do we take the parts of the model that are not flawed and are unparadoxical and then try to construct a new model using the full research into the field and not just the dogma paradoxical ridden current model investigation? And it's my suggestion that unless we begin to reject dogma and to embrace these areas of thought, essentially, what harm can it do? What harm could it do to consider the opposite to the dogmatic paradoxical ridden model? Unless we put this model forward as true and begin to adjust our responses, unless we begin to adjust our responses according to this new model, then essentially the old model is the working model, the one that all of our systems are based around. And until we can replace that working model with a complete model, then we leave the working model in place. This is again with the Newtonian quantum bridge, the Newtonian quantum paradox. I know that you've got the likes of Nassim Haramein, who claims to have developed a unified field theory. Einstein spent most of his working life working towards a unified field theory, and this would be where the paradoxes between the quantum and the Newtonian would be. Richie. Yeah, the old model is based essentially on senses, on our senses, and as the quantum world adequately describes, our senses can be very easily fooled, and more to the point, when we start talking about quantum mechanics, that the very act of observation affects the outcome. This is why we use double blind in any field of scientific inquiry. Double blind means that even the scientist the scientist who's doing the inquiry doesn't have any active part in the setting of the experiment, because if they do, their bias towards the expected outcome appears to affect the expected outcome. The observed outcome is affected directly by the mind of the observer. And this is again, if we take the observed effects from the quantum world and apply it rationally to the universe as a whole, which isn't that much of a leap for my mind. If everything is made of the component parts that are observed in the quantum world, and if the quantum world is as described, then essentially we have a universe that is made of discrete components that are affected by the mind of the observer. This is a very, very important point to make, okay? That the very construct that we see as the universe, as observed reality, may well be being created by the observer. So, I mean, we're coming here into the realms of the primacy of consciousness over the primacy of matter, and the Newtonian model describes the primacy of matter, the fundamental stuffness of matter, of the material world, and then we apply to that the Darwinistic, mechanistic description of the biological world as a set of random chance events that conspired to create biology as we see it today. So the general worldview at the turn of the last century was that of the primacy of matter, the primacy of substance. And what has come out through the quantum revolution is that in fact the very stuff of substance is affected by the observation of mind. So this means that the observed universe upon which Newtonian mechanics appears to be applied is made of this stuff, which is either created or certainly modulated by the application of a conscious mind. So this leaves us with a very paradoxical view of the universe, of reality. How can we equate these two paradoxical but observable universes? And this is where Richie was coming from here, is that the sciences that we have pursued are all the sciences of the sensory world, and without going too much into it, the sensory world that we live in is a very restricted one. The what we call visible light, we only call it visible light because that's the part of light, of the light spectrum, that our eyes can perceive. And it's butterflies, many insects use the ultraviolet spectrum. When you shine a black light, a UV light at most flowers, you'll find that they're like little landing strips for bees. And accordingly, insects use this UV fluorescence in order to be able to home in on the service parts of the plant. So we're immersed in this observed reality, this sensorial reality that we perceive to be the only reality, and yet here we have other densians of the same planet, other biology sharing the same planet that has senses way in excess of anything that we have. I mean, like a bat's hearing, the bee's ultraviolet sight, a grasshopper's ability to hear with its legs by listening to the stalk of grass that it's standing upon. I mean, if we could consider ourselves with these senses, a dog's sense of smell. Literally, a dog doesn't perceive its world with its eyes like we do, and this is something that most dog owners don't really seem to grasp particularly well, is that although dogs have very acute sight, because their primary nerve input into their brain is from their olfactory nerve, which is the sense in between taste and smell, and it's the olfactory nerve that stimulates things like childhood recollections when you smell cut grass or cakes cooking or whatever. It's not the actual smell that does that, it's when that smell is detected by the olfactory nerve, it sends signals directly into the core structures of the brain without going through any computational part. And as a result, a dog's perception of the world will literally be, you know what I mean, a dog to us appears to be telepathic, to a large degree, because we have no idea how they're perceiving the things that they're perceiving that are beyond our ken. And part of the reason for this is their incredibly acute hearing, but also this incredibly acute sense of smell and the ability to literally smell individual molecules on the air, and to be able to associate that molecule with a particular activity. So yes, if we're going to base our science on the human senses, then we have to then confront exactly what it is to perceive a human sense. And when we begin to look into that, we find that we actually live in a dark, silent, touchless world of the synapses and the mind locked in the sealed cavity of our brain, and that everything that we perceive as reality is nothing more than an electrical signal being perceived by our brain. If we were to be plugged in Matrix style to some grand three-dimensional holographic computer system that fed those signals into our nerves, we would be completely unaware that that was the case. We would be as immersed in reality as we are now. There would be no way of perceiving any difference. You know what, Keith? So if we are at a point where, in order to be able to model reality, we first have to ascribe meaning to words in such a way that the description of the thing that we apply the meaning for that word to is without... Oh God, hold on. Is without ambiguity, so that it's clearly defined. Essentially, what I'm talking about is codifying the language with which we use to describe reality, with again this kind of Occam's razor applied logic and deduction to reduce any descriptive word to its minimum core meaning. And from that minimum core meaning, through the use of the English language, which is such a wonderful language to use for jargon, because you can apply words as an adjunct to other words to change their meaning. I mean, non is an obvious one that we can use straight away. So we have ordinary reality and non-ordinary reality. We can all agree on what ordinary reality is, I think, to a larger extent, and then those areas of reality that some of us perceive, our observed universe, those of us who perhaps straddle the realms of ordinary and non-ordinary reality on occasion, we have an observed universe that is at odds and paradoxical to the observed universe of those people that have existed only within the realms of ordinary reality. So we have a model where a complete paradox prevents any further discussion while we remain within the realms of dogma and of perceived meaning rather than of agreed meaning. So essentially what I'm suggesting is that we begin to reduce the presumed meanings of the words that we use to describe most of the descriptive terms that we need to describe this common communal observed reality. And once we have assembled a language, once we have assembled a working jargon, I was minded when we were at this ITLAD meeting the other day, there were four of us sat at the table, and when we came to describing soul, all four of us had a completely different concept as to what soul consisted of. So if you take concepts like soul, mind, experience, reality, life. All of these terms have significantly broad interpretations, and that what we need to have essentially a technical jargon in which these words do not necessarily apply by their common meaning, but instead we use a reduced agreed meaning. So let's for an example, let's choose mind and brain and soul. Well, a lot of people would consider that those three are exactly the same component, so that wouldn't be very well reduced. We would have three words to describe the same thing. So what we need then is to consider what exactly it is that we think of as mind, what exactly it is that we describe when we discuss soul, and what exactly it is that what we discuss when we discuss life. And from these reduced, jargonized, codified meanings, we can then begin to formulate a meaningful discourse in which everybody can be clear about that which is being discussed. Kaz earlier mentioned my bifurcation. It's not my bifurcation theory at all, actually, but my particular favourite subject, and that of bifurcation, the separation of species at the point of genetic mutation into a main species and a subset. Where was I going with that? Yes. Okay. So we have the descriptor word, the bifurcation. It's not in common usage, so it's probably not that good an example. But essentially, the word itself is the definition of the word itself is a discussion in and of itself. And so the using of that word in any attempt to discuss the possible eventualities of bifurcation then becomes a very clouded and a very muddied issue, where people end up discussing things at odds with each other when in fact they're in agreement, simply because their use of terminology doesn't concur. Again, there, like I say, bifurcation was probably not such a good example, but certainly maths was one. There recently, I was discussing my 72 souls theory on the Cheating the Ferryman forum, and the discussion very soon got off of any discussion about the soul, and in fact possibly ascended into a dissection of exactly what maths consists of, and whether or not number pre-exists mind. So again, even with terms that we all think that we even with terms that we all think that we know and understand, there seems to be I've still got something anyway. There still seems to be a broad swathe of concepts around the descriptive word that are not necessarily helpful to the argument. So in my mind, again there we use mine, in my what is it that I am, what is it to be, what is it to have a mind, is the mind the same as the brain, and I'm rambling a little. I'm going to go to a tune while I just collect my thoughts and possibly refresh my teacup here a little, and just try and re-rail myself back onto something more like a narrative for you. Again, this is so difficult to do just off the top of your head. This would be so much easier if our Phil was here and gave me somebody to talk to, even if he does completely put me off track all the time. It's just somehow easier to do this face to face than it is to do to a blank screen. Alright, I'm going to stick on for you. I'm going to stick with the dubstep, sod it. I was in Cockney Thug mood, but I'm not going to go with Cockney Thug, so this is Casper and Where's My Money?
Yeah. About the money. Money? I don't know if we're going to be able to get it over to...
what do you mean you're not going to get it? What?
Secondary holding account.
Holding account?
We need to get it into the other account.
What?
You know, with the state of the music industry nowadays and record sales and all that.
You know what? Where's my money?
You know all the dolphins ghost in town. The bitches all love me 'cause I'm fucking
Casper and Where's My Money? Dubstep to the max. Right, okay, Ray, you've kind of spurred me there. If I'm losing you, I do apologise. And this is something that I must continually emphasise, that I come from a perspective of absolutely zero academia. I managed to make it through whatever it was, 10 years of compulsory education without barely a single qualification to rub together. So all of my apparent academia is merely based upon the consideration of that which I observe, that which I know to be true, and that which I believe to be true, and the continual comparison of those three elements. And if that which I believe to be true is at odds with that which I observe, then I have to adjust that which I know to be true accordingly. And by this process of continually applied logic and deduction, one slowly moves closer to a personal model that encompasses a description of reality where the observed model and the known facts are not paradoxical and not at odds. Again, if we're talking about the observed world, then we are talking about the input of our senses into our brain and the mental processes that are applied to those electrical stimuli in our brain. Now, because of that, I think that the very base, the base point at which to begin the creation of this new codified language has to be with our descriptions of mind. I'm particularly fond of the Jungian trinity of mind, with the description of the separation of the ego, the superego, and the id. That is the present mind, the conscious mind, that mind with which you interact with the world through. The overmind, which we become aware of in certain moments where we may be considering one action and then another version of ourselves appears to intercede, usually with a slightly parental overview on our actions, and it's usually that which we consider our conscience, or I don't know, I suppose the voice of our morals or whatever, and that would be the superego, the overmind. It's not the chatterbox of the ego. It doesn't clamour on all the time in your head with a persistent dialogue. The superego is almost like the observer, the one that simply sits in the background and watches the adolescent mind explore its world, and as long as it does so in reasonable safety, then it tends to sit back and simply take this role of observer. If it perceives great danger or risk, then it tends to intercede and, like I say, tends to take this slightly parental role in chiding us that perhaps we shouldn't be putting our finger in that flame. Then we have the id, the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind at one time was a mere postulation. I think now there is enough scientific evidence in that there is quite patently a subconscious mind, hypnotism, past life regression, all manner of repeatable experiments can be used to show that there is a part of the mind that registers sensory input on a raw data level, where literally everything that goes in through our senses is registered by the unconscious mind, and only a very tiny part, the part that is filtered by our kind of gatekeeper of the mind. Essentially, we would all be overwhelmed by our sensory input if we simply thought about and consciously perceived every single sensory input to our brains as an active thought. Where our brains, we wouldn't be able to function. The level of sensory input would simply overload our senses, and we wouldn't be able to even perceive the world. It would just be a jumble of noise. Essentially, this is the state that you can get into with various psychedelics. LSD is particularly known for confusing the senses. You begin to see sounds and hear light. You can feel, not only your outside connection with the world, but also all of your internal organs, which can be quite disturbing at times. To suddenly be able to feel your liver is a little peculiar. But essentially the liver does have a skin, it does have a sensory membrane, and with hallucinogens to essentially disable the filters that normally prevent you from sensing your liver, you suddenly become aware of the fact that you have a liver. You can feel the action of your stomach, which is, again, something that most people are completely oblivious to. All of these sensory inputs are happening all the time, but we simply apply a filter of the mind to keep the... what tends to happen is we tend to have a threshold level where for something to enter into our conscious mind, it has to come above this threshold level of sensory input in order to be perceived. So we tend to have a preferred sense. Most of us with good eyesight tend to prefer our eyes. So if there are other sensory inputs that are disagreeing with our visual sense of the world, then we tend to get things like car sickness set in, where the mind becomes confused because it's receiving an input that is above the threshold of sensory of the sensory. My mouse stopped working just at the end of the tune. Fucker, I do love technology. Right, okay, we're back on air. Sorry about that. The wonderful Sam broadcaster crashed on me again. Right, okay, where the bloody hell was I when Sam crashed? Somebody remind me where I was. That's a good cup of tea. Right. No, I'm completely lost. So what you people don't realise is that even after I've got nearly coming up for 8 months of this now, every single week, but almost without fail, I think I've had about 2 weeks that I've come to the mic, and beforehand and entirely during, have I not been just a nervous bloody wreck. My missus says that I don't even look nervous, but a swan comes to mind. They're all serene above the surface and paddling like fuck below. Oh god. Right, okay, so where were we? Right, model of the mind, Jungian model of the mind, the Trinity, id, ego, superego, as the kind of Occam's razor description of the mind. I don't think it can necessarily be broken down into any more simplistic parts than that, because simply that the the ego is quite obviously not the superego or the id, and that the superego is not the id or the ego, and etc., etc. So I think we have descriptions of three completely separate components. Now, from that trinity, we then have to consider, are those words generally agreeable enough to be the terms with which we frame those intellectual constructs with. To me, that would be the description of mind. So perhaps first of all we need to decide exactly what mind is, and it certainly would appear from non-locality experiences that mind is not brain. Certainly the experiences of people undergoing some of these heart surgeries at the moment, where they quite literally stop the body is essentially dead. All mental processes, all measurable electrical activity in the brain is stopped for a period of up to, I believe it's about 8 hours at a time. They do this by lowering the blood temperature and essentially putting the body into extreme hypothermia, and then reviving it afterwards. And the remarkable thing about this is that when the people come back from having had no brain activity, they still have all of their memories intact and often can remember having been aware of the time where they were apparently dead. Not necessarily always due to a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, but simply still being aware that they were still thinking, and what's that? What? Hold on. Okay, yeah, no, that wasn't me playing the track before. Hold on, what's this? Track that was the assault. No, I was playing both of them. You gotta get you're a puddlehead, love. You ain't gonna get the Cockney vibe. It doesn't matter how hard you try. You ain't enough of a thug. you got to have extracted at least half your brain to be able to listen to tunes like that. Right, okay. So we have this trinity of the descriptors of self contained within something that we can describe with the term mind, and although mind processes appear to be largely driven by activity in the brain, as can be measured on kind of MRI scans and the like, and repeatable areas of the brain are stimulated by the same external stimuli or by the same internal stimuli, i.e. thoughts. So we have essentially the mind appears to be not the electrical activity of the brain. The mind seems to exist outside of the biological machine which it appears to inhabit. So if everything that we perceive of observable reality is perceived by this mind, which isn't part of the biological computer, which we feel as the sensorial organ for this mind, when in fact when we can leave the body, astrally project, near-death experiences, non-locality of mind, remote viewing, hypnosis. There are so many aspects of non-locality of mind that are again provable, repeatable, observable, that we have to stop thinking of mind in terms of the body that it inhabits. So to some degree we get back to this description of soul, that possibly the description of soul and the description of mind are in fact a description, two differing descriptions of the same basic descriptor of reality, of observed reality. So what we then need to do is to decide, well, if mind is soul and soul is mind, then surely we do away with one of the terms, or refine both of the terms so that they more specifically, like the ego, the superego and the id, more accurately describe observed reality. So if we're talking about mind and we're talking about soul, see again there we can use adjunct words. Okay, so if we interactions, the astral projection, the you know what I mean, all of the elements of everybody's observed reality, unless we are going to put certain observations of reality into the realms of the deranged mind and of the illusory and of the fantastic, which is what tends to be done by science. But in a lot of these realms, we're talking about shared reality, so we're talking about two people observing the same thing. Well, this then has to become observed reality, and if that observed reality can't be seen by a third person, then it can't be described as ordinary reality. Okay, ordinary reality is the reality that we all share and that we agree. Oh, for God's sakes. Right, I'm back on again, am I now? How long is this going to last for? I really don't know whether I can plough ahead with this. I'm having enough trouble maintaining.
A reflection on people being more harsh or uncaring for each other. A reflection on people being more harsh or uncaring for each other. Reflection on people being more harsh or uncaring for each other.